In general, it can't be a very happy fate to be asked to follow on Professor Judith Butler's talk under any circumstances. I'm not quite sure why you've done that to me, but since we've only just met, it can't be that she's trying to get back at me for something. In this case, it's particularly hapless situation for me because a great deal of what I have to say in this talk has in some ways been dealt with really in much more detail by Professor Butler in this very rich and extraordinary talk. But anyway, we'll make do. Palestine is in a strong sense a non-place, constantly required and repeatedly failing to prove its existence. Take the revealing case of Elia Suleiman's Divine Intervention, an avant-garde film about life under the occupation, structured as a series of vignettes largely without dialogue, which was denied initially the right to compete for the Best Foreign Film Oscar Award in 2002 as the entry for Palestine on the grounds that such a place did not exist. The work of the imagination in fashioning its own collective and communal vectors is itself erased in this demand before even its existence can be acknowledged, that the work of art prove that in fact it comes from somewhere. Palestinian works of cinema and literature, Edward Said often pointed out, experience the judgment that they come from nowhere as an internal pressure and anxiety, not just an external act of censorship and repression. The strange life of the name itself in world politics over the last several decades is testimony to the unreal reality of this non-place. Unlikely though this seems, George W. Bush was the first sitting American president, at least since the 1950s, to use the name itself, by itself, in public, Palestine. Even in the public discourse of the Clinton administration, which is generally thought to have brought at least the Fatah movement in from the cold, Palestine could only ever occur as qualifier for something else: the Palestinian territories, the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian people, even a future Palestinian state, but not Palestine. The name of this non-place, however, has many other lives, distinct from, though never quite untouched by, the language of geopolitical power, as the inside, ad-dakhil, for Palestinian communities dispersed across the world, above all, but also in the political imaginations of the Arab world more broadly, and in many places in the Third World, from its resident appearance in Urdu poetry in India and Pakistan to the so-called Palestinos in Havana, migrant workers from the Cuban countryside living in impoverished, refugee-like conditions. This paper is part of a chapter of an ongoing book project in which I turn to Palestine, in the fuller chapter, I turn to Palestine as image and idea in order first to attempt an inventory of some of its modes of signification and circulation in our worlds. My ultimate goal is to suggest some ways of understanding the uses of Palestine as historical experience for critical thinking in our times. To this end, I shall turn to the elaboration of Palestine in Said's oeuvre, which undertakes, I argue, a radical refashioning of the meanings of homeland. In such works as After the Last Sky, Reflections on Exile, the brief essay, the memoir Out of Place, and a polemical exchange with Michael Walzer on the meaning of the Exodus narrative, Said reflects explicitly on the possibility of criticism and the relationship to a matrix of ancestral places and meanings. The strength of the Canaanite position, I'm quoting Said now, the strength of the Canaanite position, that is, the exile position, he writes in his critique of Walzer, is that being defeated and outside, you can perhaps more easily feel compassion, more easily call injustice injustice, more easily speak directly and plainly of all oppression, and with less difficulty try to understand rather than mystify or occlude history and equality, unquote. If secular criticism in Said's sense entails, as I have argued elsewhere, a dialectical disturbing of location and connectedness, of nothing less than our habitual modes of inhabiting the world, then Palestine provides for it, for secular criticism, the image of the appropriate forms of attachment to place and world. To place and people, of ties to the missing homeland. As Professor Butler has argued in her recent book, Parting Ways, Said refashions an earlier tradition of exilic thinking, which was, of course, significantly informed by Jewish experience, into a way of thinking about cohabitation in historical Palestine between Jews and Arabs. I'll turn to this a little bit down the road. Far removed in its affective and conceptual investments from the cosmopolitanism that has become prominent in some recent discussions in the humanities, secular criticism is in the end more an exercise in anguished and failed attachment than one of sanguine detachment. The homeland of criticism is, for Said, a missing homeland. Above all, however, I'm interested here in the troubling question raised by the disappearance of Palestine itself. What does it mean to be inside or outside a place that does not exist? The Palestinians emerged in the post-war era as the quintessential stateless population, marked by displacement and exile, uprooting from home and ancestral places and meanings, from state and nation, from the most basic political and civil rights, and from visibility itself. I take the emergence of this figure as my starting point in order to examine the very possibility in our times of thinking of, with, and for one's homeland. How and when did this figure emerge, the figure of the stateless Palestinian? What does it do to us and for us? What meanings does it carry? What warnings and portents in those battered pieces of baggage that it carries as it rushes yet again toward the imagined promise of relief across some border or boundary, or is expelled from one country or territory to another, only to end up in a no man's land that is at once territorial, political, and juridical? I shall be concerned with questions such as these and what follows. But this globally recognizable figure is also given to stubborn, even irrational acts of resistance, both inside and outside this place that does not exist. Ad-Dakhil and Al-Kharij, to use the resonant terms of the everyday Palestinian lexicon, inside and outside, raised to the level of conceptuality by Said, and to which I shall also return below. Starting in the last years of the 1960s, regionally and globally dispersed communities of Palestinians underwent a historical transformation that was simultaneously political, social, and cultural in nature. The revolution, as it was called, Ath-Thawra, lasted nearly 2 decades and produced one of the most iconic political figures of the second half of the 20th century, the Palestinian militant or Fidai, a figure of planetary scope and reach. The Fidaiyin, who in their time came to be at the core of the worldwide culture of anti-imperial internationalism of the post-war decades, constitute one of the least documented and least understood of the many vanguards of the global 1960s and 1970s. This internationalism of the Palestinian national movement in the decades of its emergence is well known, but I think little understood. The Fidaiyin were at the forefront of the worldwide culture of radical anti-imperialism, whose emergence we now generally associate with the Congress of Afro-Asian States, held in 1955 in the Indonesian city of Bandung, or rather with its political and cultural aftermath. The ability of the movement to draw to its cause militants from places as far afield as Japan, Germany, and Venezuela, the appeal of the movement to intellectuals and writers in places as diverse as Pakistan, France, and South Africa, its ability for a while at least to strike with seemingly equal facility inside Israel, in the Jordanian desert, and in European cities, and the ostentatious and seemingly reckless braggadocio inherent in the reputation of the stateless Palestinian Fidai, slipping in and out of countries and traveling across the world on multiple passports, all point to an orientation toward the larger world that marks at the very least a paradox, coming as it does from the sons and daughters of either the peasantry or what was a local and utterly provincial petty bourgeoisie in terms of the larger Ottoman cultural system. The very choice of the international jetliner, the icon of a newly promised mobility on a world scale in the 1960s, as the stage for the performance of political claims, draws our attention to this worldly orientation. The Israeli invasion of Lebanon in the summer of 1982 was aimed at destroying this vanguard, and therefore also the larger historical possibilities associated with it. Said, who belonged exactly to this generation of Palestinians, he was a year older than Ghassan Kanafani and Wael Zuwaitar, for instance, both assassinated by Mossad in retribution for the Munich Olympics massacre in 1972. Said, who belonged exactly to this generation of Palestinians, is a late figure of this historical constellation, embodying the late style of Bandung, we might say. In a brief and well-known passage in Chapter 9 of her magisterial work, The Origins of Totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt has given us a way of thinking about the new world, the global system of nation-states, that was only beginning to emerge at the time of its writing from the ashes of the European genocide and the coming collapse of the colonial empires. I quote this well-known passage in full. After the war, it turned out that the Jewish question, which was considered the only insoluble one, was indeed solved, namely by means of a colonized and then conquered territory, but this solved neither the problem of the minorities nor of the stateless. On the contrary, like virtually all other events of our century, the solution of the Jewish question merely produced a new category of refugees, the Arabs, thereby increasing the number of the stateless and rightless by another 700 to 800,000 people. And what happened in Palestine within the smallest of territory and in terms of hundreds of thousands was then repeated in India, Arendt writes, and on a large scale involving many millions of people. Since the peace treaties of 1919 and 1920, the refugees and the stateless have attached themselves like a curse to all the newly established states on earth which were created in the image of the nation state. For these new states, this curse bears the germs of a deadly disease, unquote. First of all, that Zionist presence and project in Palestine are in a full sense colonial in nature is stated in a matter-of-fact manner here as directly observable fact, and Arendt places the destruction of Palestinian society within a larger, more global colonial frame, identifying a structural link between the destruction of Palestine and the dissolution of society in the subcontinent that is known as the Partition of India, which took place over almost exactly the same stretch of time in the late 1940s, within months of each other, the knot of a global crisis in the emergence of the post-colonial system of nation-states, the impossibility of assimilating the world's diverse societies, cultures, and civilizations into the emerging nation-state system without massive uprooting and displacement and even annihilation of the populations newly defined as non-national peoples and minorities. More broadly, therefore, Arendt's analysis foregrounds the fate of these non-national populations, which form the ground of statelessness as a symptomatic political experience. That's her word. Nation, minority, partition, statelessness, along with the notion of rights, this conceptual constellation forms the armature of Arendt's understanding of the political crisis of the modern age, at whose center she places the history and the mode of resolution in Palestine of the Jewish question. Arendt also articulates here an early perception of one of the most stark facts of the political history of the post-war world, the transfer of the problem of statelessness at mid-century from European to Third World and more particularly Palestinian populations. When we encounter stateless refugees in the 1930s and 1940s, these are primarily Europeans and disproportionately Jewish. From the 1950s and 1960s onward, the term evokes only colonial and post-colonial peoples. The relevant agencies of the League of Nations dealt largely with displaced Europeans. Those of the United Nations have dealt overwhelmingly with third world populations. To say the very least, the Palestinians have played an iconic role in this historical transition and transformation, a transition whose most well-known elaboration literature is perhaps to be found in Men in the Sun, Rijal und Shams, the well-known novella by Ghassan Kanafani, which Said often described as the quintessential narrative of post-1948 Palestinian experience. It is arguably one of the more powerful narratives of the experience of statelessness and dispossession from the second half of the 20th century. Men in the Sun was published in 1963, 3 years after Kanafani's arrival in Beirut at the end of a trajectory that had taken him from birth and childhood in Akka in Palestine to a refugee camp in Damascus, where he grew up, and then Kuwait, where for a while he worked as a teacher. In Damascus, Kanafani had become involved with the Arab nationalist movement under the mentorship of George Habash, and as the group around Habash morphed in 1967 into the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Kanafani emerged as one of the leading intellectuals in the revolutionary PFLP, founding and editing its weekly organ, Al-Hadaf, the Goal, and serving as its spokesman. He was, as you perhaps know, a prolific novelist, short story writer, critic, historian, educator, and journalist, widely recognized in his own lifetime as one of the leading Palestinian writers. In Kanafani's novella, the existence of Palestine as a place is very much in question. It is, in at least one obvious narrative sense, a non-place. The action in the present is located entirely in Iraq, and just inside Kuwaiti territory, hundreds of miles and a decade away from historical Palestine. Hence the allegorical significance of the death of the Palestinian refugees after having left Iraq, but before having entered Kuwait, in a sort of no man's land between two nation states, in a strip of land that belongs to no one state, and therefore may be said to belong to all those who have no state or place of their own. The refugees, in the famous ending of the story, suffocate inside the tanker under the blistering desert sun as the tanker driver and part-time human smuggler is delayed by the minor officials at the border post who engage him in light banter. No man's land is a recurring image in the literature of the historical transition I am exploring here, including in the literature of India's partition. In Kanafani's story, the border and no man's land play a slightly different role, with the novella exploring one of the most recurring experiences associated with post-1948 Palestinian life, namely the sudden emergence of a population stuck at the border between two political and territorial entities, as most recently seen in our own times at Iraq's border with Syria and Jordan in the aftermath of the American invasion, and also on the Gaza and Egypt border. Finally, as Said has noted, the question that Kanafani's story confronts is that of representability itself. I quote Said, "the almost metaphysical impossibility of representing the present," unquote. In other words, how do you represent a non-place? Return, al-auda in Arabic, is of course one of the master concept metaphors of Palestinian political life. But regaining Palestine is in no simple sense a question of land and territory in Kanafani's novella, it having become in the process of its disappearance a signifier that attaches itself to too many things, places, and memories, generating an excess of meanings. Behind all this, of course, lurks a sense that in the story, lurks the sense that the Palestinians, the victims of the quintessential victims of fascist militarism, in Europe in the first half of the century, have become precisely like those Jewish victims in their homelessness, and both the iconic figure and historical agents of a new internationalism. The story's famous and controversial ending, the tanker driver, Abul Khayzuran, reproaches the dead men for dying silently and not banging on the walls of the tanker as the heat became unbearable, but leaves their bodies in the end on a garbage heap outside Kuwait City, also carries echoes of the experience of the camps. Before dumping the corpses, he searches them carefully and removes their few valuables. At one level, of course, the nation states in play here and the border whose crossing is a matter of life and death for the stateless refugees must be understood as signifiers in their dense historical particularity. Iraq and Kuwait, carved out as distinct political territories by the colonial powers out of the collapsed Ottoman Empire in 1922, largely in line with the terms of the secretly reached Anglo-French Sykes-Picot Agreement 1916, which was first exposed at the time after the war by the Bolsheviks, because the Tsarist Russia had been a non-signing party to the agreement. Mark in the story the colonial partitioning of Arab society in the southeastern regions of the Ottoman sphere and the installation of a system of rival polities whose destructive legacy it fell to Pan-Arabism to try, unsuccessfully in the end, to confront and overcome. The continued working of the historical trauma attached to 1922 may be gauged by its repeated manipulation in the discourse of militant jihadism today. At another level, the story's very delinking of the question of Palestine from territory, the refugees are not attempting to return to their own historical homeland, for instance, points it towards larger questions concerning the political landscape of the 20th century, making of the story a parable about the notion of homeland as such, about the characteristic political form of the modern era, the nation-state, and the curse, to cite Arendt's mixed metaphor, that attaches itself to it like the germs of a deadly disease. It highlights the hugely unequal distribution of the ability to cross international borders that is a constitutive feature of the global system of nation-states. More specifically, it highlights the perils and the maddening paradoxes of any attempt at mobility if in fact you come from nowhere. It is these many paradoxes and the fragmentedness and discontinuities of Palestinian experience that Said takes as a subject in After the Last Sky. There is, to say the least, something curious about the place of this book in his oeuvre as a whole. It contains some of the most powerful language he ever wrote, and yet it continues to be one of the least commented upon of his works. It is the declaration of love for a globally dispersed agglomeration of communities and ways of life, only tenuously tied to each other, with almost none entirely free of the threat of annihilation, and yet somehow confident of their mutual connections, affiliations, and responsibilities. An encounter with its prose, open-ended and bleeding on each page into Jean Maure's remarkable photographs, is always a compelling experience. But whether this effect is primarily aesthetic, ethical, political, all of these together, or something else altogether, remains far from clear in the end. Any attempt to capture and fix this argument, claims, or message about an external reality in propositional terms seems to fail miserably. And yet the language itself makes it impossible for a reading of it to be merely a contemplative or formalist experience. Is it polemic or is it literature? In this sense, it can be compared to some of the more complex and advanced and avant-garde examples of the essay form in the Western languages in the 20th century. Most obviously, of course, to John Berger's works, especially a Seventh Man, also a collaboration with Jean Maure, the same photographer, which had served for Said as a model for his own collaboration with the photographer. Said's own comments about the language of the essay, however, seem strangely schematic at first. I quote, "The book's style and method, the interplay of text and photos, the mixture of genres, modes, and styles, do not tell a consecutive story, nor do they constitute a political essay. Since the main features of our present existence are dispossession, dispersion, and yet also a kind of power incommensurate with our stateless exile, I believe that essentially unconventional, hybrid, and fragmentary forms of experience should be used to represent us. What I have quite consciously designed then is an alternative mode of expression to the one usually encountered in the media, in works of social science, in popular fiction." And this is a theme he returns to repeatedly, commenting on the form of the work itself and the sort of appropriateness of form to historical experience. Style and method. What does it mean programmatically to write a fragmentary narrative, as he calls it? What is the nature of this voice that reflects upon its own programs and procedures in this manner? Does it stand outside of and exercise some form of command over that experience of dispossession and that alternative mode of expression? Again, Said's phrase. What this passage reveals is the dimension of hybridization in the event that is this text, a dual performance as artist and critic, narrative and critique. Locked in embrace with Moore's photographs, Said's text offers glimpses of ways of inhabiting the world that, as he puts it elsewhere, are unredeemed, strange, displaced, and outside moral concern, from the perspective of power and possession, and seeks to establish their indispensability to the possibility of critical thinking itself. After the Last Sky is, of course, a hybrid work in a more immediate sense as well, since it consists precisely of both language and images, or more precisely of both verbal and visual texts. As W.J.T. Mitchell has noted, the always tense and ambivalent relationship between photography and language, is the photograph structured like or subject to the codes of language, or is its primary feature an uncoded indexical relationship to an event, appears in an even more intense form in the photo essay as a hybrid form. And in After the Last Sky, language and image are placed in a shifting and dialogic relation to each other, with the pictures appearing now as illustration, now as occasion for the writing. Above all, the photographs become in the book a means of exploring the complexities of figuration itself, as the text works through the tension within them between a person or event on the one hand and figures of various sorts on the other. The most important chapter in the book, called Interiors, in my view, most important, is also the most sustained engagement with gender anywhere in Said's writing, I believe. One of the photographs where this tension rises to the surface and becomes the explicit concern of the text is a close-up of an older woman, face deeply lined, wearing thick glasses and smiling with what looks like a hairnet on her head. Said's initial remarks on this photograph, I quote, "A face I thought when I first saw it of our life at home," unquote, are interrupted with the intimation that the author's sister had broken this process of figuration with the reminder that the subject of the picture was one Mrs. Faraj, a distant relative of the family's in Amman. As Mitchell observes, the passage marks an acknowledgement of Said's larger, quote, ambivalence toward the associative complex woman image home, a confession of his complicity in the sentimentalizing of women and of the lost pastoral homeland that fixates the imagination of the Palestinian male, unquote. This is Tom Mitchell. This anxiety finds a profoundly more painful expression in the retelling of the story of his mother's loss of identity, of political identity, on getting married in mandatory Palestine. The British colonial officer who tore up her passport because she would now travel on her husband's noted that this would further the cause of Jewish immigration into the country by creating bureaucratic room for one more immigrant. The mother's loss is inscribed into the story of the family's very origin, with the author as a male Palestinian coming to recognize and acknowledge the guilt of his own formation in this complicity between patriarchy and the project of colonial usurpation. Women thus play a central role in the exploration of the elusive Palestinian notion of the inside, ad-dakhil, to which Interiors, this chapter, is dedicated, but which is one of the more fascinating and compelling facets of the book as a whole. At one level, ad-dakhil registers the fluctuations and inversions in meaning that result from the steady expansion of the Israeli state's control over communities and places once part of Palestine. I quote, "It refers first of all to regions of the interior of Israel, to territories and people still Palestinian despite the interdictions of the Israeli presence. Until 1967, therefore, it meant the Palestinians who lived within Israel. After 1967, the phrase expanded to include the inhabitants of the occupied territories," unquote. Before this expansion, to be min ad-dakhil, from the inside, as it were, from inside, was an abject condition, Said writes, a life most directly under Israeli domination and cut off completely from the wider currents of the Palestinian and Arab worlds. After the incorporation of the West Bank and Gaza as well into the sphere of Israeli sovereignty, to be inside, already inside as it were, is a sort of privilege to be envied, the privilege, Said says, of obduracy. After the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, which destroyed organized Palestinian political life in the country, the focus of Palestinian life, Said suggests, is turned from outside to inside. And the most dramatic sign of the shift is the mass uprising, the first Intifada, which broke out in 1987 in the territories 20 years after their occupation. But at another more expansive and more elusive level of meaning, Said notes, ad-dakhil points to those zones of the private and interior that emerge wherever Palestinian lives are lived, zones of mutual encounter, recognition, conflict, solidarity, and above all, coded exchanges. I quote again, "The second meaning of ad-dakhil is slightly more complicated. It refers to privacy, to that region on the inside that is protected by the wall of solidarity formed by members of the group and the hostile enclosure created around us by the more powerful. For those in the diaspora, the challenge, we might say, is thus how to live on the outside. On the outside as if on the inside. And within hearing of outsiders, many resentful and frequently outright hostile. It might even be possible to say that this paradox comprises one of the book's central preoccupations, the myriad ways in which beleaguered and globally dispersed populations produce and reproduce a sense of commonality, but also a relationship to a past that is, in the dominant languages of politics and power, as I've tried to argue, a non-place. The force of exile, which Said translates, which is the word that he uses for the Arabic word manfa, an estrangement, ghurba, is so powerful and all-encompassing in Palestinians' lives, Said suggests, that wherever they encounter one another, they seem to recreate Palestine, or at least an inside, however tenuously and for the moment. And present in the background of any account of the inside is the figure of woman as custodian of the interior, its memories, and its inheritance. Thus, despite the, quote, absence of women, as he puts it, in the public life of Palestinian communities, he notes that nevertheless, and I quote again, "I see women everywhere in Palestinian life and see how they exist between the syrupy sentimentalism of roles we ascribe to them, mothers, virgins, martyrs, and the annoyance, even dislike, that their unassimilated strength provokes in our warily politicized automatic manhood," unquote. Said's political turn in the late 1990s to the binational position in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as the only properly secular solution in his terms, and as Professor Butler pointed out, the term he actually uses is not binationalism per se, but the one-state solution. First outlined in a New York Times magazine article in 1999, must be understood in the context of the historical shift of the focus of Palestinian political life from outside to inside. Speaking of Jews and Palestinians as, quote, two communities of suffering, Said argued that both, quote, must resolve that their existence is a secular fact and that it has to be dealt with as such, unquote. To act and think in accordance with the secular condition of social life entails the dismantling of exclusivist narratives of possession, of the land, of suffering, of historical memory in both communities, unquote. And I'm quoting now, beginning to quote. "It means being willing to soften, lessen, and finally give up special status for one people at the expense of the other. The law of return for Jews and the right of return for Palestinian refugees have to be considered and trimmed together. Both the notions of Greater Israel and the land as the land of the Jewish people given to them by God, and of Palestine as an Arab land that cannot be alienated from the Arab homeland, need to be reduced in scale and exclusivity," unquote. First of all, we may note that binationalism appears here neither as an a priori principle nor as an empirical matter of political expediency, but rather as a continuous process involving mutual adjustments and reorientations that are social in the full sense, that is, incorporating the social imaginaries that both emerge from and inform social relations themselves. Second, this process is a secular one, in the neologistic sense in which Said always used the word secular. This process is a secular one precisely because it rejects the transcendental, absolute, or exclusive nature of narratives of national social cohesion. Said's rethinking of the binational idea, which is part of a larger contemporary recognition of the de facto existence of a single, though extremely polarized and unequal political and social entity from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, and Professor Butler has really worked on this very brilliantly in her recent book, draws on the Zionist binationalists of the early and mid-20th century, but is nevertheless distinct, rejecting any notion of a redemptive tie or return to the land. It above all carries the insistence that the return to a territorial form of the question of Palestine and it has not always been a territorial form. That's the important thing to consider here. It above all carries the insistence that the return to a territorial form of the question of Palestine, as in the now hegemonic land for peace formula, not be allowed to freeze historical possibility into a nationalist frame. Over a decade earlier and after The Last Sky, Said had expressed misgivings about the possible direction of politics and culture in an autonomous Palestinian future, repeatedly cautioning against the danger of replicating the terms of the Zionist solution of the so-called Jewish question of European modernity. I quote, "Better are many wanderings, I sometimes think, than the horrid clanging shutters of their return, the open secular element and not the symmetry of redemption," unquote. Said's call for a one-state solution, as he calls it, therefore seeks to bring the insights of diaspora and dispersal, now an irreducible element in the history of both peoples claiming a homeland in historical Palestine, to the question of the establishment of a homeland and a state and one society of two exilic and diasporic peoples. Said's binationalism implies that the two hostile societies are now already one, inextricably intertwined in their inseparable histories of exile and uprooting, the life of the one depending irreducibly on that of the other. It envisions a state not of national but exilic and homeless peoples, and attempts to transform the Palestinian attempt to wrest a state from the global system of nation-states into a permanent rebuke to the system itself. Sorry, I've lost track of where I was. Sorry, let me read that sentence again. It envisions a state not of national but exilic and homeless peoples, and attempts to transform the Palestinian attempt to wrest a state from the global system of nation-states into a permanent rebuke to the system itself. An exilic state, in other words, not a nation-state. This is, of course, a position formulated from and with the experience of those outside. But it also reveals the profoundly dialectical nature of the production of outside and inside. For one of the most elusive and bitter ironies of the contemporary Palestinian configuration is that those Palestinians most fully inside, that is, those constituting Israel's violently redefined Arab sector, as they are often called, are also those who are most outside, distanced and decentered from a collective Palestinian and Arab existence, having become an alien presence in their own disappeared homeland without having been physically displaced from it, but placed under the permanent, constitutive threat of uprooting and dispersal. To call for an exilic perspective from outside is therefore also paradoxically to call for responsibility to the historical experience of these Palestinians who are supposedly inside. Only the fragmentary perspectives of manfa, exile, and its attendant forms of ghurba, estrangement, Said writes, can make possible now an attitude of attentiveness to the totality of Palestinian and Jewish-Israeli experience. I'll just stop there. Thank you. Thank you. Can I just stay here?
Thank you very much for that, again, lucid, moving, very interesting crossings between the different talks. We do have 10 to 15 minutes left for questions. Same procedure. Can you hear me? And I'm starting to take registrations. Anybody from this side? Somebody at the back? Somebody at the very, very back as well? Yeah. Let's start at the very back.
Yeah, all right. Thank you for your very fascinating lecture. And you referenced the previous lecture by Judith Butler as well. And I was wondering if you could nonetheless elaborate a little bit more on the notion of secularism in the work of Said, especially in your interpretation of it, and more specifically how that relates to Judith Butler's suggestion that in the history of Zionism we might find a productive interaction with the Israeli-Palestinian problem. So in short, the question would be, could you elaborate a little bit on the political value of Edward Said's notion of secularism and how it relates to the repoliticization of a religiously inspired history? Thank you.
I am for clustering the questions. Could we go to the middle, please? I'm still taking registrations. Anybody else? Looking over this side. I feel like I'm selling, so please. Yes, please.
Hello. Thanks for a very interesting lecture, Professor Mufti. My name is Khulud. I'm from Bethlehem, Palestine.
Sorry, could you say your name again?
Khulud. I'm from Bethlehem, Palestine, here for the study week. My parents are originally Palestinian refugees from a village called Ajur, which is now inside Israel. And I'm very interested in the motion of the inside-outside you were talking about, because for us Palestinians, it raises a question about also, are we internally displaced as Palestinians living inside historic Palestine, but away from our original homes? Are we refugees or internally displaced people? Because in Bethlehem, for example, we refer to Philistiniyi Dakhil, which means Palestinians of the inside, referring to Palestinians living in Israel. But for those living outside of Palestine, we also live inside. So if you would like to elaborate a bit more on that. My second question is related to the motion of statelessness and exile. And if you can elaborate a bit how exile can or does affect the writings of those intellectuals like Edward Said and Kanafani and some of those in the world literature as well. How does exile affect their writings and their representations of nationhood and homeland? Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for these two very important and very sort of rich areas of discussion. So I'll begin with the first question, and the first question asked by the first speaker or the questioner. And it's certainly the case that I mean, I even use the term neologistic really in some ways to sometimes talk about the way in which Said uses the term secular. It seems to be placed in opposition to a lot of things in his writing, but very, very rarely to religiosity per se, very rarely. And the term is used really in a way that it overlaps pretty considerably with the exilic, it seems to me. Okay. And Snatas Gurguris is in the audience here and will be speaking tomorrow, and has argued, for instance, that the point of secular criticism in some ways, or at one of the practices of secular criticism, is a kind of de-transcendentalizing practice. That is to say, Said is interested in, in critically engaging with the forms of authorization of any kind of cultural project, okay, forms of authority that are implicit in any kind of cultural, including intellectual project. And that sort of critical posture or orientation of a kind of never-ending immanent criticism is what he calls secular criticism. So secular, in other words, is directed at a much broader range and swath of cultural positions than the term religion or religiosity would traditionally imply. So that's sort of one, and I guess the implication in some way is that that what is being questioned is the way in which supposedly secular cultural forms or social forms come to replicate some of the modalities of the religious or the theological. That, I would say, would be the in some ways, the investment in the use of the word secular, which of course has such a very different life and usage outside of his work. So that's sort of one very initial response to what you've asked about secularism. And he never really says secularism, actually, by the way, as a footnote. I mean, it's always as a modifier for criticism or something of that sort. It's certainly not an ism or a set of doctrines for him, certainly not. He shows no interest in his work in anything that we could recognizably call the secularization thesis or anything of that sort. In fact, I mean, his very few comments really in his works on historically specific forms of religiosity like political Islam are of a very different nature. They're sort of attempts to understand in his secular terms, as it were, what the Islamic turn really means in Arab Muslim society. And in some ways, I guess I would say that that secular criticism would engage political Islam, for instance, not in terms of its claims about, let's say, man, humanity, and its place in the world or in the universe or something of that sort, okay? But about its historical claims. And insist that that place where this set of claims have to interact with very different other sets of claims is the secular social space. That's what he means by secular. That no kind of internally cohesive set of narratives or narrative structures or something of that sort can exhaust any social space. And in that excess is what he really sort of signifies, I think, by the term secular. Okay. Professor Butler's engagement with Buber in particular and the Zionist binationalists and having a certain kind of value, I think I agree with that. I mean, and I think Said himself would have agreed with that. I think he's very influenced by those thinkers, but is trying to do something in the end quite different, as Professor Butler very carefully pointed out. And there is a strong Orientalist colonial sort of baggage of various sorts, obviously, in their work, right? But it is fundamental to Said's approach to this question that nothing is a priori not of use in rethinking, in thinking a future, as it were. Okay, and certainly that goes for all the intellectual productions of the Brit Shalom and Ikhud movements. Okay, so that's a couple of responses to the first speaker. You know, the chapter called Interiors and After the Last Sky really, I think, is one of Said's most brilliant writings. It's an extraordinary piece of writing and very elusive, and I'm still struggling after having read it many, many times and been sort of struggling to write about it for a long time. Still really struggling to sort of, you know, get a fuller sort of sense of its richness. But to put it very crudely, it is precisely an account of the dialectic of inside and outside in that sense. And it parallels in uncanny ways his account of the dialectic, I would call it that, of filiation and affiliation in the later essay on secular criticism. I would even go so far as to say that in some words in this chapter in After the Last Sky, Said is giving an account of the historical experience that informs that later theoretical elaboration, or that earlier, theoretical elaboration, filiation and affiliation. So in some ways, he is really, he is showing us the process by which certain conditions of contemporary exilic experience can come to acquire conceptual form in the essay on secular criticism, where at the core obviously is this discussion of different modes of social cohesion, different modes of belonging that he calls filiation and affiliation, drawing on all kinds of traditions from German sociology, to even the Romantics, obviously, in some ways, and the modernists. Okay, so he's profoundly aware that inside and outside are not stable categories, let alone places, but that they are constantly mutually transforming each other and undergoing processes of inversion, outside becoming inside and inside outside, in all kinds of very rich and complex ways. He's very, 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 very self-aware of that. And in part, it's an account to find the language to give a sort of adequate account of that process that makes the text as elusive and difficult as it is. And then finally, your question about exile and statelessness and how I see exile as something that occurs in Said's writings or that affects his writing. Very crudely, I mean, what he's interested in is rethinking exile. And once again, here, obviously, he's drawing upon an earlier tradition of exilic thinking in profound ways, namely largely Jewish tradition of exilic thinking in very, very profound ways. And essentially what he's trying to do, if I may sort of put it this way, is to explore the conditions of possibility of the transformation of this abject condition into he uses the word enriching in one place, empowering in other places, way of thinking, way of feeling, way of being political, okay, or ways in the plural. So the whole challenge is, given the historical experience of exile, first of all, for exiled peoples, how do you transform that into a kind of enriching and empowering position? Secondly, I think there is a very broad set of claims, as I've tried to argue in some ways in this talk, about how criticism and really the intellectual process in general needs to be affiliated in his own sense, in his own sort of use of that word, with historically concrete experiences of exile in our world, right? So it's not about overcoming nation and nationalism once and for all, and it's certainly not, strictly speaking, a cosmopolitan project, as some people have argued, including my friend Bruce Robbins. I disagree with that really quite strongly. So the demand on criticism, in fact, to some extent, I think he goes so far as to suggest that criticism is not criticism unless it is, in fact, fundamentally exilic in its affiliations. And the attitude towards the national as a frame of experience and frame of cultural identification and all of that is also very dialectical. You can't stand outside of it, certainly, in some final kind of way. And also, as Professor Butler was arguing, in fact, historically speaking, we can also very easily endorse the historical necessity of nationalisms under certain kinds of historical conditions. But the overall project is always to put it in quotation marks, as it were, right? To put it in some form of erasure. I think that's sort of what I would say now. Yeah. Thank you.